Good day to you all again. And here's another edition of the Suburban's video podcast, Beyond the Pages. And I want to thank everybody because the reaction has been terrific. There's a lot of you tuning in. And welcome again to my studio, to my study turned into a studio. As you know, a lot of these podcasts are me talking about editorial issues, Mark Lidbetter talking about sports, Chelsea St. Pierre talking about business, Mike Cullen talking about entertainment. And every now and then we have a very special guest. And I'm very pleased to have a guest who's not only an important public figure, but I consider a friend and one of our best public servants. Christopher Skeete is the MNA for St. Rose and Laval. He's physically the closest CAC MNA to Montreal in the greater Montreal area. He's full disclosure, he's been incredibly responsive on things when we've had public issues, when we've had issues with citizens. This is the go-to man, and not just because he's parliamentary assistant to Premier Legault and with special responsibility for the Anglophone community, for the English community, but because he's generally a committed public servant. He's been a businessman, he's been a community activist. That's why he got into public service. And he's certainly risen to the challenge. Chris, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks a lot for having me. I appreciate your interest.
It's true. Okay, well, first of all, Chris, this is certainly not the kind of first mandate issue that you thought you'd be handling.
No.
This has thrown everything off the scale. And Chris, you're in your office right now, right? Or at home?
I'm at home right now.
But you're in the office 3 times a week.
Yeah, we go into the office, do some telework mostly, but we try to keep our foot in the door to make sure that we're responding to people's needs and whatnot. And I also want to make sure that we don't lose the habit of sort of, being on the go. So we've decided that it's time to open up the office. We can't quite just yet receive citizens at our office, but we're going in to make a go of it.
Excellent. Well, it was very pleasant talking to your assistant, Anaya. Let's get started. Let's get started with what we've been writing about and what's been the latest issue for your government and for the Premier. So on Thursday, Friday, the Premier made a point that it's important that the public understand perspective and that perhaps the media has been a little too dramatic in its coverage. And I've been writing about this for weeks. But let me throw an idea past you. When the figures are announced, cases, hospitalizations, ICUs, could it not be a help if the first line, the first figure that's announced is total tests negative? Then we go into total cases because people have a hard time, and we keep repeating it, people have a hard time understanding that generally through all jurisdictions, you've got 8% of the people who are being tested test positive. That doesn't mean they're sick. But because that top line is missing, and also the hospitalization line never gives the number of people who already recovered, do you think maybe we could get a different way of presenting the numbers at the Premier's press conferences without sounding unfeeling? But this is information that people have to keep it in perspective.
Yeah, I think you're touching on an important part, Beryl, because, one of the things that's missing in this pandemic is uniformity of data. If you look across all jurisdictions that are dealing with COVID, they each have their own way of counting people who are sick, people who are tested, their own strategies for testing, their own strategies for counting the dead. For instance, in Quebec, our numbers look high, but that's because because obviously we have problems, but one of the reasons why our numbers don't look as good as, let's say, Ontario or maybe even other jurisdictions in the US is because we count suspected deaths. So even if it's suspected, we put it out of caution in the category of COVID to make sure that we're catching all the deaths. We do the same thing in the summertime when we have extreme heat warnings. We'll make sure that if we suspect that someone died of heat exposure, we'll put them in the list to make sure that we're getting all the data. That's a very good methodological approach that not all jurisdictions use. One of the other things that you brought up on the top line of your question there was, what about listing all the people that we're testing? Problem with that, Beryl, is we actually have a strategy for testing that targets hotspots. So for instance, if we're going to go into an area and say, well, you know what, we know that the elderly are particularly vulnerable, let's only test those elderly in CHSLDs, well, of course, we're going to get a higher percentage, especially now, of the rate of COVID in seniors' residences. So because we're sort of not using a representative population, obviously, if we use the data of saying the number of tests we've done versus number of positives, we're going to have a higher number that is in the public. So really, what's coming around, what's coming, to fruition in the data internationally is looking at the number of those who are sick in the population, confirmed COVID cases, marrying that to the number of deaths, which is, and you said it before, it's a cold way to look at it. And then, of course, analyzing the la surmortalité is what we're calling it. And this is where it gets interesting in terms of comparisons, because what you want to see is typically in the month of March, how many people are dying in Quebec. Superimpose that with the number of deaths you actually have for COVID in the month of March, and then you sort of get a picture of, well, we should be losing X percentage of people in March. Why are we losing Y percentage? And that seems to be a good indicator. And what we're seeing in Quebec, we have a 19% surmortalité. I'm trying to translate that as I'm saying it. But surmortalité.
All right, we're bilingual. Nous sommes bilingues.
Yeah.
Fine, don't worry.
And what we're seeing in Quebec is 19%. And when we compare that to, let's say, New York State, they're at 250%. That gives you a sense of the scope of the problem in Quebec and how it fits relative to others. But of course,
this is part of the problem, and I think I understand the Premier's frustration.
Yeah.
We can't translate. Media cannot translate that kind of in-depth thing. What I'm suggesting, and I'm sure you'll take it back as a suggestion, is that we simply give media a number. This is the number of people. Okay, this is our new cases. Fine. But new cases mean people who have tested positive for COVID but are asymptomatic even. Give the number for people who've tested negative. People, I'm telling you, 8 out of 10 people don't know that we've tested over 400,000 people and they've been negative.
Yeah, well,
just put out the number.
We do give out the numbers. The problem is, and you saw it
in written form, yes, but you got to go then dig. But all the media immediately goes, they put it online right away. What verbally comes out of the press conference every day?
The problem with that, Beryl, and I really have to insist, is because we're targeting the testing, the number that we get is not representative of what's happening in a population, because we're sort of fudging the denominator.
But but that's okay. You still have to show people that, okay, we have 42,000 people who've tested positive. I wouldn't even call them cases. I would change the nomenclature. They've tested positive, but 400,000 have tested negative, just without commentary, just fling out the number, because that brings us to a second thing that the government brought out toward the end of the week, which is vital to know. And again, it didn't get the headlines. We wrote about it, but it didn't get the headlines because I think there's interest sparked in panic, and we have to reduce the panic nature. Yes, this is terrible. Yes, people are suffering, but 8% of the people in all jurisdictions, isolation or immunity, are getting COVID. The numbers are, and Dr. Fauci actually, in writing in the New England Journal of Medicine on March 26th, he anticipated that. He anticipated that all the numbers would turn out flat. But the Premier made a very important point toward the end of last week, which I didn't know, and I consider myself pretty educated on the subject after 20 stories or 30 stories, and that is that Montreal, all of Quebec, but Montreal particularly, since that's the hotspot, we have 3 times the number of seniors in homes per capita than any other major city in North America. Now, since 85% of deaths come from those homes, unfortunately, and that's another issue we'll be discussing. It's important for people in Montreal, as we try to reboot the society, which we have to do, and the Premier is quite right, to know that. It gives them a sense of comfort and also a sense of reality of the public policy. So we're certainly writing about that this week, but if that was a headline statement, as it was Thursday and Friday, that has to be pushed. People have to know that.
Well, he mentioned during one of his conferences, and I remember it also made me reflect on our choices as a society, is we do have per capita, tendencies of putting our parents, our elderly in these homes. And he used the word, it's a social choice. We made the social choice, a collective choice. Yeah, and if you look at it, there's a little bit of Quebec DNA in there, right? Because if you look at it objectively, we do the same thing with daycare. We've institutionalized daycare much in the same way that we've institutionalized growing old. And for all kinds of reasons, I think we did it because
Yet we're doing this like all other societies. I mean, New York City, 65% of their deaths were from seniors' homes. And we're doing it at a time when like 70 is the new 60. Fortune 500 companies are hiring back 70-year-olds because they want their institutional memory. People are living longer and living better. And another interesting number is that for all and the Premier was right, we have the societal choice. But I've read another fascinating number on the weekend. Only 20% of seniors over 75 are in homes. 80% are living on their own or living with families. So it's a problem. How are we servicing that 20% since the austerity cuts 10, 15 years ago in our provincial budgets, more than anything right now, because we've got 80% living at home, and the numbers for them are far different from the CSHLDs.
Well, I think it's all about what we do from here. And I think what unfortunately is lost in this whole debate is my party was the only party that was making seniors issues a campaign pledge in the last general election. We were the ones saying that those CHSLDs were not a good model, that they were not suitable for the generation that built our country and our province. And we were the ones that said we need to give them a place to live, not a place to die. And that was our platform.
Your Minister for Seniors, Marguerite Blais, made a point of that on the campaign trail and as minister.
And she came back to politics for that reason. She said, look, if you want me, Monsieur Legault, I will join your team, but I need to see this through. And the Premier told her, you can come, I will give you what you ask for. And that was the condition for her to come back. So it is kind of a cruel irony that, we're dealing with this, because we were doing it. And we had already created over 2,600 spaces, and we're trying to refurbish those places. Madame Blais had done hundreds of visits to various CHSLDs and residences. So it's a cruel irony that we're dealing with this. But again, I'm happy that it's put the focus back on that priority, and it'll make it easier for a politician like myself to put money in that budget now, because we'll have populations okay to do it.
And the Premier got a lot of credibility when he said, look, I've only been in power for a year and a bit, but the buck stops here. I have to deal with the CSHLD problem. And that's the first time we've seen a Premier say, look, I'm not passing the buck. It's on me. Not because I did it, because that's my position. I'm in power.
Well, people sometimes call us, I think the word was, bulldoze, right? And I think what he said was, in the same way that I can pass my laws that I believe are good for Quebec society when I have a majority government, I could have passed a law that said, I'm increasing these salaries right now. And he said, I didn't. I thought I could wait. I thought I had the time. Manifestedly, I didn't in that case. My bad. Now let's negotiate those salaries and let's fix the problem. And I think that's the part that we own, right? Because we did have a choice, and we made a calculus, right? We said, do we really want to reopen a collective agreement with all the risks that, of social peace that comes with? Or do we just wait to renegotiate the contracts in March? And, he chose to not pick that fight at that time. And of course, he owned it. And I think that was very laudable. I was very proud of him that day.
Let me ask you another question. Let's move away from the seniors for a moment. I found, and I've written it, and I've had to advise readers who call me as, somehow you're an editor, they think you're an elected official, but they think you know everything, but you certainly know everything. I found at the very beginning, back in late March, that the support programs coming out of Quebec were not only more efficient in terms of, I know people who are getting their Quebec checks in 10 days, while Ottawa, it's not a knock on Ottawa, but the bureaucracy is bigger there. They were waiting weeks. The support programs for small business, particularly the ones through Investissement Quebec that guaranteed the banks. You can go to your banker, you can tell them what you need, $2.5 billion from Investissement Quebec, it's there. I found them really efficient. People have been calling me, complimenting that. Do you, both as a parliamentary assistant to the Premier, but also somebody responsible for the Anglophone community, which has a great number of entrepreneurs, did you find you got a lot of calls on relief, on Quebec relief? Because I'm finding also that a lot of Anglophones particularly, but even Francophones, they don't know about a lot of the business programs. They know about the $573 a week. but the business programs they don't know a lot about. Are you seeing yourself guiding your constituents or anybody who's calling you in your position through the programs?
You know, when I did my consultations in last fall, one of the things that, you know, became clear, for instance, this statistic was striking. You know, Quebec government gives about $1.1 billion through 65 various government programs, including, you know, community-oriented programs. And when you look at the data, English-speaking Quebecers get about 2%, 1%, 3% of the 1.1 billion, because oftentimes English-speaking community groups don't even apply for the programs. It's as though, well, there's two things. There's kind of a cynicism that the English community has vis-a-vis the Quebec government. I think that's the leftovers of the sovereignty movement, Bill 101. I think we still carry that fear, that skepticism of the Quebec state. So I think that's one of the reasons why the English community doesn't have the reflex of looking to Quebec. And the other thing is the ability to transact in French, right? I think sometimes community groups are saying, you know, I'd love to go after this Quebec program, but, you know, the paper's this thick and I don't really feel comfortable filling out the paperwork. Ottawa will let me write it in English. So we have this tendency to go towards Ottawa for all our needs, even though sometimes they're in provincial jurisdictions. So that's one of the reasons I think the English community doesn't have the reflex of going towards Quebec government programs. We see it in other spheres as well. But yeah, you know, I would agree that our programs were very targeted because they were meant to assist those who had a direct problem in order to protect the economy that we have. But I'm going to push back a little bit to say, once, you know, you could say a lot of things about Ottawa. You could say a lot of things about the way that they do business. You can't say that they haven't been aggressive in terms of protecting people's revenue and being present in terms of helping businesses. So
No,
sometimes
I'm not saying they haven't made the right commitments, but I found every day, because I'm helping people, that Ottawa makes a commitment, very nice, and then they'll tell you, the Prime Minister tells you, it'll be 2 to 3 weeks before the website is up. I found in late March, when the Quebec government set up its programs, again, the $573 a week, people were getting their checks in 10 days, and there was no English-French problem. IQ, the support for small business, $2.5 billion. I called the bankers. The bankers had the forms already from Quebec, from IQ. They had the guarantees, and they were serving people in English and French. And the nice thing about that program was, you're a small businessman, you call your banker, he's already got the info from Quebec.
Yeah.
It's the pickup. It's not the intention. Ottawa had wonderful intentions, but Quebec had the intentions, but they seem to have all the stuff in place, the paperwork, the bureaucracy in place.
Yeah. I'm gonna quote the Minister of Finance. We had a meeting with him recently, and he's been great actually in his availability. He said, and I quote, "Moi j'aime pas livrer des choses qui sont pas attachées."
Absolutely. I wrote that. When Quebec promises something, c'est là, it's there.
It's right? So I think, but I mean, look, I think that's a personality thing. I think you're seeing the DNA of our way of doing business, where we will build it and then we'll announce something concrete.
Right.
I think Ottawa probably works the other way. They're saying, listen, don't worry, here's the program and we'll get it to you in time, right? Yeah. I think it's just a stylistic difference. The important thing is when people need help, that they get it.
Stylistic, but also managing a bureaucracy. I mean, we still have 8 million people here. It's not 35, but it's a quarter of the country. And
I like my way. But absolutely. That's not to say that the other way is not
Pierre
good.
Fitzgibbon, your economy minister, has done an incredible job with the small business stuff at Investissement Quebec. And he's, people feel an authenticity when he speaks. Like, this is a businessman, he wants to do business. Leave the politics alone. I'm not going to say anything that I'm going to be held accountable for that I can't deliver. So he's been very effective.
Yeah, I agree.
Let me come to a few problems. One of which is my personal little, so you're going to take back the message that we need more numbers flashed on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
So 3 weeks ago, I think 3 weeks ago on a weekend, all editors, all news directors got a bulletin from Quebec. I believe it was from the Premier's office. The blue bulletins that come out of the new restrictions or the new rules for everything, the consigne, those blue things. Premier Legault puts it on his Instagram page regularly. And this one had some very weird things in it. Neighborhood restrictions, and don't do this, don't be somebody who doesn't live under the same roof. And they said it seemed very strange to me. So I called the public affairs people of the police, and I won't mention who because he's a very effective guy, and he said, "Oh no, we're not going to go crazy." Okay. Well,
You also called me.
I did.
In all transparency, you also called me.
I said at the beginning, you're an effective go-to guy. Hey, that's what you get. A good deed does not go unpunished. You've done enough good deeds. I'm going to call you. So that weekend, the cops. I'm sorry, I've told this to the public affairs guy at the at SPVM, Andre DeRoche. The cops went crazy, and they issued over 300 tickets in Montreal alone. And I met the people. I'm trying to help them get couples sitting in a car that aren't on the same address, sitting in a parking lot. Couples going to a market like Atwater Market or Jean Talon Market, but they didn't live in the area. Couples from Laval and Longueuil who happened to come into the city to walk around Place du Canada. And they were giving tickets from the cops because they were out of their neighborhoods. Now, Monday morning, I won't mention who, but somebody from the Premier's office called me and said there was a translation error. The words used were not right. We never meant any of this. I get it. So I translate that message to the police, and then I had a talk with the cops. And the cops said, no, we're giving these tickets. You're right. There's no laws. There's no bylaws. We're following the consigne of our commanders to do social distancing. But that consigne has now resulted in over 1,000 tickets in Montreal alone between the SPVM and the SQ on the island of over $1,000 to $1,500. Madness, mad tickets that the Premier's office told me was not the intention. Is there any way to get a message from Public Security Minister Guilbeault, she's Deputy Premier, literally to Chief Caron in Montreal? Because all these cops are admitting to me, and I've interviewed 6 of them, we are not writing these tickets based on any bylaw. There's no law that these people are infringing. We're told to use our personal judgment on the street by our commanders. Is there any way that the government, through the Public Security Minister, can talk to Chief Caron and say, hey, look, this was not the intention. You're supposed to give tickets when people are congregating, when there's groups in parks, but stop ticketing couples, literally couples, just that aspect of it. Is there any way to get a message across? And by the way, the particular translation error was that whoever wrote that weekend's thing wrote neighborhood restrictions. They didn't mean to. They meant to write regional restrictions. That's when still the Laurentians were blocked off. And they got the message across to the police, but the police aren't following those directives in Montreal. Is there any way that somebody can have a nice conversation with Police Chief Caron and tell him, could you tell your commanders, you have the power because we want to break up clusters when kids aren't stop bothering ordinary people.
Yeah, I think your listeners are going to be very happy because they're going to get a sense of what inside baseball looks like, because this is the conversation you and I had, and
viewers, not just listeners. They actually look at you. You're pretty today. It's fine.
Oh well. So what's cool about that is they'll get a sense of what the kind of discussions we have in the background are, and basically there are 3 things that I think that people need to remember. So there was a public health emergency that was declared. By virtue of that public health emergency, there are certain powers that are given. But here's the thing. 1, legislation is a broadsword, not a scalpel. Yes. It is, and especially at a time like this, we're using the all-encompassing Public Health Act to make sure that we can do what needs to get done. But the other side is, and don't forget this, in a democracy, there are three centers of power, and the judicial branch will have a responsibility at the end of all this, when the courts resume, to hear those cases where potential abuses occurred. So I'm very confident.
Chris,
I'm very confident, Beryl.
You're from the people. Ordinary working people do not have the time to schlep to the municipal court downtown and contest their case. It's not
for $1,000 ticket. I would make the time. For $1,000 ticket.
All I'm asking, I'm not asking for a commitment. I'm asking that you will have a word.
Oh, but I did already. When you called me, I did all this.
Okay, do it again, because it's not stopping.
Okay. But have faith. But you know what? We can agree to disagree on this, Beryl. But have faith that in the system there are checks and balances, and that people will have the ability, if they
Okay.
feel that they've been wrong,
On the checks
to go
and
back.
balances, issue, full disclosure, as you know, Julius Gray, I'm just looking at my watch because I don't want our Zoom session to be ended. Uh, Julius Gray, who's my cousin, has said the rule of law is not eliminated. The charter still applies. You still have to follow law. So you want
Exactly.
law? The Public Health Act of Quebec says an executive, the premier, can declare a public health emergency for 10 days. He can lock down for 10. After 10 days, he's got to go back to the assembly to get permission for another 20 days.
Actually, it's the Council of Ministers, and they've been renewing it.
But you can't renew it. There's nothing in the law to renew it, but put that aside. But when the cops tell me there's no law being broken, we're working on our instincts, you can't enforce punitive measures on instincts. You can't enforce punitive measures at all. I'm just asking that somebody talk to the police. Chief Caron needs a talking to, quietly, nicely. Okay, that issue's aside. Number two, it was an irritant, and I don't know what happened in the process, but the famous issue, which a lot of readers have been calling me about, those famous pamphlets that came all in French. Now, the funny thing is, where I live, it's a 150-unit apartment block, I got them in both languages at the beginning. So what happened internally that some whole areas didn't get them in English?
So, that was a tough one, right? Because, in the pandemic, the idea was to just get all the information out, okay? And then, of course, they realized that some of our most vulnerable citizens are English-speaking Quebecers who might not understand the guide. But let's just clarify a couple things that haven't always been clear out there. So for starters, the guide was always available online, okay? So if you had an internet connection, which I understand it's not everybody, if you had an internet connection, you were always able to consult the guide and go online to print it, okay? Second thing is, if that wasn't good enough, you always had the ability to order it. So you can order it for yourselves, and we tested it out. It takes about 7 days for you to get it. So that was always made available to everybody. Now the question is, it wasn't mailed out to you. You didn't get it in the mail. Now that's something that
that's the funny thing is, I got both French and English from the get-go. I got two.
That's great. I don't know what mechanism did that.
I don't know.
But I do know that it wasn't sent out.
Okay.
But so what we did and what we corrected was, first of all, we've added money in the communications budget. Madame Nathalie Roy has added more money to make sure that local medias are protected by increasing the investment in advertising. So we've campaigned. We've done a lot of campaigns and information campaigns in English media and French media. Second thing that we did, and in the Suburban, we did it as well.
Yeah.
The 4-page pamphlet.
And by the way, that's another thing. We thank you for your support of media. And I must say, I'm going to do a segue, and you're being very respectful of the feds, but provincial government support has been extraordinary of media. We're getting your 2 pages and 3 pages a week. The feds promised it. We're not getting it. We get it once every 3 weeks. I know. I'm not asking. I'm just telling you. That's point of information. You don't have to. You don't have to respond.
The other thing that we did. Thank you for letting me off the hook.
Take the compliment.
Thanks for letting me off the hook.
No.
So the other thing that we've done also was the famous guide, and the question was, how do we send the guide to English-speaking Quebecers? How do we know? So what we did was we realized that Revenue Quebec has a list of people who preferred their documentation in English, and we used that list. By the time we wrapped our heads around it, by the time we printed 600, 800,000 copies, now it's being delivered, and we're there now. So, it's a little late, but to be fair, it was always available online. The only people who didn't get it were those very specific people who, A, had no access to internet, B, had no access to a printer, C, didn't know anybody who did, and C, couldn't get access. So, there was a big kerfuffle made out of that. But I think, honestly, if you look at our batting average, we've been pretty good.
Chris, final question, because the thing with Zoom is they tell you it's 40 minutes, but they never show you a clock. So let me just get to the final thing. And the school question. Now, we came out very early supporting the Premier's efforts to reopen the schools. Chris, I can't tell you, there were weeks where I got no letters on anything else, but no, I'm not sending my kid back. And no amount of my response could convince them. What happened in the decision-making of all that? I'm sure it was anticipated, But we knew we had
Yeah.
to get the kids back to school to let people go to work.
Well, I'm on the record for saying that for me, for my kids, for my family, after analyzing my situation, it was the right call for me to send my kids back
Right.
to school. But, you know, it's not up to me to tell people what the choice is. That's why we made it optional. The idea is people had the choice to send their kids back to school if they thought that it was good for them. If you have a parent that's immunosuppressed, if you have your own breathing problems or have cancer or whatnot, don't send your kid back. It makes no sense. But for other people, it could make sense for them. So that's what I thought was weird about that whole uprising.
Yeah, people were
Because,
not hearing that it's optional. They just were not
well,
hearing it.
yeah, for the life of me, I couldn't understand why people couldn't wrap
It's
their
like
brains
going
around
back to
that.
the first issue, the number of cases, people weren't hearing it. It's like it's got to be hammered.
Well, I think what it did, my takeaway is we did
Oh,
such
by
a
the way, I'm
good
sorry
job
to
of
interrupt you, but I forgot to ask this in the question. There was also an awareness that there was an economic inequality aspect to it. In other words, poor parents who they didn't have a choice; they had to get to work. Richer parents, their kids were either in private schools or they had private daycare. They didn't care. So that is another aspect that all governments are going to have to address going forward. It's not a Quebec problem; it's a national problem.
hmm I agree. Um, so I think the idea for me was always getting the information out there that people had the choice, but I can't for the life of me. And my takeaway, as I was saying before, was that I think we did such a good job of educating the public that this was a serious issue, that when it comes time to telling them it's okay if
Yeah,
a controlled return to normal life sort of is scary. And I think
yeah,
that's just
the fear
because
is
we were so
already in.
successful at first.
It's easy to shut down and not so easy to get back because the fear
Yeah,
is
well, so, oh, that's my Apple Watch who thinks I'm speaking to her. So basically, the idea here is we did such a good job of educating people that
right.
now to make them understand, and it's more complicated, right? Who goes back and when and how. I mean, that's a lot harder to do than, okay, everyone stay home and get paid, right? That's necessarily going to be more difficult.
Chris, last question, and I hope Zoom will allow us very briefly. But before I ask that, how can people get in touch with you? What's the best way for people to get in touch with you if they have an issue?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to go off the list of phone numbers. ChristopherSkeete.com. That'll lead you to my Facebook. From there, I'm easy to find.
Last question, kind of philosophical. Let's keep it short. I'm afraid of the Zoom watch, which they really, Zoom people, please put in a watch on these things. It's a wonderful tool, but how do any government raise money after this? We know that a great percentage, the Retail Council, Restaurants Canada, we're looking at 20 to 30% non-openings in a lot of industries. We're going to need money. Everybody's in debt. Only America and Britain can print their own money without an IMF agreement. And Canada, we're at 105% of our borrowing capacity. I hate to ask the question, but generally, and not Quebec, tax increases in the offing, generally, in terms of what you've heard in public policy?
Yeah, I think what we've already said, and if you look at today is May 18th. So May 18th, La Presse, there's an article that Christian Dubé, the president of the Treasury Board, gave to Monsieur Lessard. Today they're talking about whether or not there's going to be austerity and whatnot. We've already said no. I think two things. One,
it's okay. Austerity is okay if we start cutting. If we start cutting the non-essentials, it's not necessary to have that much spending on multiculturalism and diversity. We need to spend on the essentials. That's a saving of a couple of $1 billion.
For me, I think what's important is in times of economic crunch, the government needs to be more present. It's the reason why we've advanced $3 billion worth of spending in order to inject it into infrastructure. So that's one way that we're going to keep people working. But the other thing is, and I think this is what we're not talking enough about, don't underestimate the transformation, the economic transformation that we're going to see. We're already seeing a lot of buy local initiatives coming back. We're seeing the reshoring. People are talking about moving away from their dependence from for instance, China, things like that. I think we've asked ourselves a lot of strategic questions as to why we can't make our own ventilators and why we can't make our own blouses and masks. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity in this new economy, and I think we're at the front of an economic change. And I think, like all economic change, there's going to be winners and losers. But I do think that overall, I'm pretty optimistic with what's coming up. I think as long as governments don't fall into the trap of cutting arbitrarily and aggressively. I think we have to stimulate the economy, reinvest in our local capacity. I think if we do that, we'll be okay, but it's going to take some time.
My dear friend Christopher Skeete, MNA for St. Rose, Parliamentary Assistant to Premier Legault. I'll leave it on the optimistic note, and you will have the last word. And I thank you very much for coming on Beyond the Pages, and hope to have you back when times are.
Take care, guys, and thanks for listening.
Chris, it's a pleasure. And all of you out there, thank you again. We'll be coming to you shortly, and you'll be able to see this interview with Christopher on our website. Thank you very much. Good day, good luck, and Chris, thank you very much again.
Take care. Bye-bye, everybody. Stay safe.
Bye.